April 1st, 1945, before dawn, the waters off Okinawa were filled with American ships. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, and aircraft carriers stretched across the horizon as the largest amphibious force yet assembled in the Pacific prepared to move toward the beaches. The island was the final major barrier between the American fleet and the Japanese home islands. Capturing it would provide airfields and an advanced base from which the United States could intensify operations against Japan. But Okinawa was not defended like the islands the Marines had fought earlier in the war. The Japanese had spent months preparing a defense designed specifically to survive American firepower. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, understood what would happen if he placed his strongest positions directly on the beaches. American battleships and aircraft could destroy exposed defenses before the infantry even reached them. So much of the Japanese strength was held farther inland, around ridges, caves, tunnels, artillery positions, and fortified hills. The idea was simple. Let the Americans come ashore. Let their ships and aircraft spend their ammunition against positions that were largely empty. Then force the advancing troops to fight through a defensive system that could survive the first bombardment and keep firing from concealed positions. It was not an attempt to stop the invasion at the waterline. It was an attempt to turn the entire southern half of Okinawa into a battlefield where every advance would cost time and casualties. When the first American waves approached the Higuchi beaches, however, the Japanese guns did not erupt in the massive counterattack many American soldiers might have expected. The landing was initially almost unopposed. Thousands of Marines and soldiers moved inland while engineers cleared routes and vehicles began coming ashore. Behind them came artillery, tanks, ammunition, fuel, communications equipment, and medical units. The absence of heavy resistance was not an accident. It was part of the Japanese plan. The defenders were waiting for the Americans to move away from the protection of the fleet and deeper into the island. This was where the battle would become different from a simple amphibious assault. The Americans were not trying to win the island with the first wave. They were establishing a system on the shore that could immediately support the next stage of the operation. Naval guns could continue striking targets ahead of the advancing troops. Aircraft could attack exposed Japanese positions. Engineers could repair roads and crossings. Artillery could move forward as the front moved south. The Japanese had prepared a fortress. The Americans had arrived with an entire military system designed to dismantle it piece by piece. The speed of the American advance began to expose the first weakness in the Japanese plan. The defenders had expected the Americans to spend valuable time securing the northern part of the island before reaching the main defensive belt in the south. Instead, the landing force expanded rapidly. Within days, American units had captured the northern portion of Okinawa, secured additional airfields, and established supply routes capable of supporting a much larger offensive. The Japanese had preserved their strongest forces, but that also meant they had surrendered territory without forcing the Americans to pay heavily for it. The battle they wanted would have to be fought farther south. There, the terrain changed. Hills and ridges created natural barriers, while caves and underground positions protected Japanese troops from the enormous concentration of American firepower. The Americans could not simply move forward in open ground. Each ridge had to be reconnoitered, bombarded, isolated, and then assaulted. Marine and Army units learned to work closely with tanks, artillery, engineers, and aircraft. When infantry encountered a fortified position, they did not always attack it immediately. Artillery could pound the area first. Tanks could approach under infantry protection. Engineers could clear mines or destroy obstacles. Flamethrower teams could attack caves that ordinary weapons could not reach. The objective was to reduce the defenders' ability to fight before sending large numbers of men directly into the strongest positions. The Japanese defensive system was built around the opposite idea. Its strength came from concealment and coordination between mutually supporting positions. A bunker might cover the approach to a ridge while another position protected the bunker from the side. Mortars could fire from caves, then disappear underground. Machine guns could remain silent until American troops entered a carefully selected killing zone. The Japanese did not need to hold every position forever. They needed to make each position costly enough to slow the American advance and preserve their main defensive strength farther south. But American firepower was not limited to what the infantry could carry. The fleet offshore could deliver sustained bombardments, while artillery batteries established on Okinawa increasingly brought heavy guns within range of the Japanese defensive belt. Aircraft attacked roads, artillery positions, troop concentrations, and supply routes. The Japanese could hide from individual attacks, but hiding did not stop the Americans from surrounding the battlefield with different forms of firepower. The result was a slow contest between concealment and detection. Every time a Japanese position revealed itself by firing, American observers attempted to locate it. Once identified, artillery, aircraft, tanks, or infantry could be brought against it. The defenders could inflict casualties, sometimes severe ones, but they were losing something more difficult to replace than ammunition: freedom of movement. As the Americans pushed farther south, the Japanese defensive network became increasingly compressed, and the battlefield they had prepared so carefully was beginning to work against them. By early May, the American advance had reached the main Japanese defensive belt around Shuri. Here, the character of the campaign changed completely. The open movement of the first weeks was over. Ahead of the Marines and soldiers stood a network of ridges, caves, tunnels, artillery positions, and mutually supporting strongpoints. The Japanese had concentrated their main strength in this area because they understood that terrain could do what the beaches had failed to do: slow the Americans down and force them into repeated assaults. The 1st Marine Division faced the Wana area, while the 6th Marine Division was drawn into the fighting around Sugarloaf Hill, one of the western anchors of the Shuri defenses. Sugarloaf was not simply a hill occupied by infantry. It formed part of a triangular defensive complex with the horseshoe and half-moon positions. Tunnels connected the strongpoints, allowing Japanese troops and reserves to move under cover. Mortars could fire from protected depressions, while machine guns and artillery from surrounding heights covered the approaches. Any American unit trying to attack one position could be exposed to fire from another. Capturing the summit, therefore, did not automatically solve the problem. The Marines had to hold what they captured while Japanese artillery and counterattacks attempted to drive them back. The American response was methodical. Infantry advanced with tanks where the terrain allowed them. Artillery was used to suppress positions before the assault, while engineers worked to clear routes and deal with obstacles. When Japanese troops disappeared into caves, the Marines could not simply assume the position had been abandoned. They had to locate entrances, block escape routes, and destroy the defenders inside. The objective was not to charge through every position as quickly as possible. It was to combine different weapons until the defensive position could no longer function as part of the larger system. The fighting around the Shuri line demonstrated both the strength of the Japanese defense and the advantage of the American method. The Japanese could force Marines to attack the same ground repeatedly, and some positions changed hands more than once. The cost was severe. The official Marine history describes the assault beginning on May 11th as 2 weeks of some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire Okinawa campaign. Yet the Japanese defense had a problem that could not be solved by stronger fortifications alone. Every time the Americans captured a ridge, artillery could move forward. Every time engineers opened another route, supplies could move closer to the front. Every time a unit became exhausted, fresh formations could replace it. The Japanese had built the Shuri defenses to make the American advance painfully slow. They succeeded at that. What they could not do was turn a slow American advance into a stopped American advance. By the middle of May, the Japanese defensive system around Shuri was beginning to lose the depth that had made it so difficult to penetrate. The Americans had not destroyed it in one spectacular attack. They had gradually taken away the positions that supported it. When a ridge fell, Japanese artillery lost observation points. When a cave complex was isolated, nearby units became harder to reinforce. When another road was secured, American supplies and ammunition could move closer to the front. The defensive line still existed, but it was becoming less connected, and that mattered more than the loss of any single hill. The fighting around Sugarloaf demonstrated the cost of this method. Marines repeatedly advanced against positions that appeared almost impossible to hold. Rain turned the ground into mud, tanks struggled to move, and Japanese artillery and mortars continued firing from concealed locations. Some units reached the top of a position only to discover that the surrounding terrain made the ground almost impossible to hold. The Marines could be forced back, regroup, and attack again. This did not mean the Japanese defense was ineffective. It meant that the Americans were able to treat a failed assault as a temporary setback rather than the end of the operation. That difference was becoming increasingly important. The Japanese could concentrate their remaining strength against one American attack, but they could not prevent the Americans from attacking somewhere else. Aircraft continued operating over the battlefield whenever weather permitted. Naval guns could strike targets along the coast. Army and Marine artillery batteries maintained a constant pressure on suspected Japanese positions. Engineers repaired roads and constructed routes through terrain that the defenders had expected to slow the advance. The Americans were fighting a fortified army, but they were doing it with a logistical network that stretched far beyond Okinawa itself. The Japanese understood that the Shuri position could not survive indefinitely. On May 21st, General Ushijima ordered the withdrawal from the Shuri line. It was a major decision. The defensive system had inflicted heavy casualties and delayed the American advance, but remaining in place risked the destruction of the 32nd Army before it could establish another position farther south. The Japanese began withdrawing through the rain and darkness, abandoning positions that had taken months to prepare. For the Americans, the retreat did not mean the battle was suddenly easy. The southern part of Okinawa still contained strong defensive positions, caves, artillery, and thousands of Japanese troops. But the most important defensive belt had been broken. The Americans had done it through a combination of pressure rather than one decisive breakthrough. Firepower weakened the positions. Infantry seized the ground. Engineers kept the advance moving. Supplies arrived continuously behind them. And whenever the Japanese tried to turn one battlefield into a final barrier, the Americans simply brought the next part of their system forward. The fortress had not collapsed because its defenders lacked courage. It was collapsing because the Americans had learned how to attack a fortress as a system. The Japanese withdrawal from Shuri did not end the battle. It revealed how much of Okinawa remained to be fought over. The surviving defenders moved south toward the Kion Peninsula, where the terrain again offered caves, cliffs, ridges, and narrow approaches. General Ushijima no longer had the advantage of a continuous defensive line like the one around Shuri, but he still had thousands of men, artillery, machine guns, and prepared positions. The Americans therefore faced the same fundamental problem in a new form: how to keep advancing against an enemy who had lost the ability to maneuver freely but could still make every piece of ground dangerous. By this stage, the American advantage was not based on one weapon. It was the coordination of many. Aircraft could attack targets identified by ground observers. Naval guns could reach positions beyond the immediate front. Artillery batteries could shift their fire as infantry moved forward. Tanks provided mobile firepower, while engineers cleared mines, destroyed obstacles, and opened routes through terrain that had been deliberately made difficult. Infantry remained the force that had to enter the caves and occupy the ground, but they were no longer expected to solve every problem alone. The Japanese defensive system had become increasingly dependent on concealment. A position that remained hidden could survive. A position that was discovered could be isolated and attacked from several directions. This created a constant pressure on the defenders. They could wait underground, but every day they remained there reduced their ammunition, food, communications, and ability to coordinate with neighboring units. American aircraft and naval forces had already made large-scale movement extremely dangerous. Now the shrinking battlefield made concealment less useful because there were fewer places left to withdraw. The final fighting was especially difficult because the Japanese could no longer retreat indefinitely. By June, American forces were closing in on the southern tip of the island. Marines and soldiers advanced through positions that had been prepared as the last defensive area. Japanese troops continued resisting from caves and fortified terrain, while American units systematically isolated each position. The campaign had become a slow process of removing every remaining source of organized resistance. On June 18, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the U.S. 10th Army, was killed by Japanese artillery fire while observing the fighting near the front. His death demonstrated that even after weeks of American advances, the battlefield remained dangerous. 4 days later, on June 22, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa was declared ended. Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, died in the final hours of the battle. Okinawa had taken an enormous human toll. American forces suffered more than 12,000 killed or missing and more than 36,000 wounded. Japanese military deaths were far greater, while the civilian population suffered catastrophically. The island had not been conquered quickly or cheaply. But the Japanese defensive system had failed at the one task that mattered strategically. It had failed to stop the American advance. The Americans had not found a way to make fortified islands harmless. They had found something more useful. They had learned how to make even the strongest defensive system gradually run out of options. The battle for Okinawa had demonstrated something that was easy to miss when looking only at casualty figures. The Japanese had not been incapable of fighting. In many places, they had fought with remarkable determination and had created defensive positions that forced American units to advance slowly. Their tunnels survived bombardments. Their artillery remained dangerous. Their soldiers continued resisting after organized positions had been surrounded. Yet none of these advantages could compensate for the larger difference between the two sides. The Japanese were defending a shrinking island with a finite supply of ammunition, fuel, food, weapons, and replacements. The Americans were connected to an enormous military system that stretched across the Pacific. That system was the real reason Okinawa could not be turned into another Guadalcanal for the Americans. Naval forces controlled the approaches to the island. Aircraft could operate from carriers and newly captured airfields. Artillery could be supplied continuously. Engineers kept roads and bridges functioning. Medical units evacuated casualties, while replacement troops and equipment continued arriving from behind the lines. The Marines and soldiers fighting in the front lines still faced the same dangers as any infantrymen, but the organization supporting them meant that one destroyed position did not destroy the entire offensive. The attack could pause, reorganize, and continue. The Japanese had gradually adapted their tactics throughout the Pacific War. They moved from exposed beach defenses to positions farther inland. They built deeper fortifications, used caves and tunnels, reduced unnecessary counterattacks, and tried to preserve their forces for a prolonged battle. On Okinawa, this strategy reached its most developed form. It made the invasion slower and more expensive, but it could not change the fundamental balance. Every defensive position existed inside an island that was becoming more isolated, while American control of the surrounding sea and air made Japanese reinforcement almost impossible. That was the real significance of Okinawa. The island had not fallen because its defenses were poorly designed. In many respects, they were designed precisely for the kind of war the Americans had learned to fight. The problem was that the Americans had learned to fight it too. They could combine naval gunfire, aircraft, artillery, armor, engineers, intelligence, logistics, and infantry into one continuous operation. The Japanese could make the Americans pay for every ridge and every cave. They could not make the Americans stop paying and walk away. Okinawa therefore became the final demonstration of a pattern that had developed across the Pacific. American forces could suffer enormous losses without losing the ability to continue the campaign. Japanese defenses could become deeper, stronger, and more carefully concealed. But each new position was eventually isolated and overwhelmed by a system with greater resources and greater freedom of movement. The fortress could resist. It could not reverse the direction of the war. If you enjoyed this story, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps more people discover these overlooked stories from the Second World War. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.